What's up, what's up, what's up? Welcome back to Southeast Asia Central here at 9752. Playing you the hits from the motherland, DJ Shane here, and I hope you've had a good week. Special shout out to the first winner of our contest. I hope Jaslyn and them Starbucks vouchers inspires y'all to do well on them quizzes. We've got a great show lined up today, so let's get it on. Alright guys, welcome back to the third in the series of these podcasts. We are still going to go on Team 1's kind of stuff today, but we're moving down the chronology, we're moving down the timeline. So today's podcast will be focusing on establishing and maintaining political stability. Basically, the content shifts from the earlier democratic phase of experimentation, the kind of instability and chaos that was going on at that point in time, to a later part of the period of independence where things start to stabilize, at least politically speaking. There are two main tracks in which how the political landscape stabilizes. Either there is a movement towards more stable forms of authoritarianism, or there is a strengthening of existing democracies to guard against authoritarian kind of elements. So going to the syllabus document itself, we are now in this red portion over here where we are looking at once again the establishment and maintenance of political stability. So later on I'll go into it a bit further, but keep in mind right now that these are two terms that we need to keep in mind, and it actually helps us because establishing a political government or establishing some sort of government is something that is more short term in basis, is in coming to power. It's about establishing the authority. But then there's more of a longer term assessment in terms of the maintenance, so that requires your movement all the way to encompass the entirety of the time frame. So pertaining to the subpoints under these two topics, we have the personalities of political leaders, how they influence the political landscape, how much of a control could they enforce or exert over their societies and their governments. The kind of tools of control that they use, they are varying in number and quite diversified. Some more subtle, some more direct, some more aggressive, some more peaceable, and so on and so forth. And the third point over there is really the focus of this subtopic over here, which is the effectiveness. And a large part of this effectiveness requires you to come up with some sort of criteria as well to judge or to yardstick what exactly do you mean by political stability and whether or not governments did establish and maintain them. So all these kind of things are important to this subtopic. The blue box you see over there, evaluate the effectiveness of governments in asserting political stability. That really is the core of this topic here. Not just a comparison of the tools of control, but using the tools of control and using the evidence seen across governments and across countries to see whether or not there was effective, whether the governments were effective in establishing political stability. So, as we go into the content itself, I just want you guys to keep in mind that across the various Southeast Asian states and their various political development, it would really vary across the case studies. And this is the core concept of diversity that we want to continue to keep in mind. And manifested in your essays, this will be sort of your comparative analysis kind of components. You can see that broadly speaking, across these 8 countries that I have put over here, I can look at them in two broad kind of development tracks. The first 5 countries that you see over there, Myanmar, which is Burma, Indonesia, Thailand, North and South Vietnam. Why I distinguish North and South Vietnam at this stage is because until 1975, they were split into two sort of independent territories. And only after 1975 do you have a reunified Vietnam. So I think in terms of countries and in terms of case studies, before 1975, if you want to split Vietnam into two, I think that's perfectly fine. It might even increase the number of case studies in consideration. So these 5 countries, broadly speaking, they exhibit common trends in that they all had some sort of democratic experimental phase. This democratic experimental phase created a lot of instability and chaos, and credibility, prestige, legitimacy shifted away from democracy and towards tried and tested forms of authoritarian rule. So in Burma, we have Burma and Thailand actually, we have the outright setup of military governments, the entire subversion of democracy. In Indonesia, Sukarno movement towards guided democracy, that is an internal subversion of liberal democratic forms. In Indonesia, there's also the strong presence of the military, but is headed by a civilian government under Sukarno. In North Vietnam, that one is outright, it's a communist party. Right from the beginning, there's not much of a democratic experimental phase. Nationalism is very closely associated with communism, and the military would underpin the entire communist movement, especially in the war setting that Vietnam was in. In South Vietnam, there was an initial democratic experimental period, and most prominently, we can see this under Ngo Dinh Diem. But quite like Sukarno, there was an internal subversion of democracy, movement towards more authoritarian forms of government under Ngo Dinh Diem. And it's quite um, uh, evident to see that after a while, even in South Vietnam, which is supposed to be, the bastion of democracy in Vietnam itself, turned and veered towards authoritarian forms of government. After Ngo Dinh Diem was assassinated, a general took over South Vietnam. A Vietnamese general took over South Vietnam. So that gives you a sort of indication as to how successful was democracy in South Vietnam. And then the next 3 group of case studies, Singapore, Malaysia, and Philippines, more or less they started out, they established democratic forms of rule, and more or less I think across the entirety of the time frame they maintained these various forms of democratic government. For Philippines, of course, there's this huge notable exception of Marcos during the martial law period. And in Malaysia, there's some of you who want to also note the period of the NOC, where for a period of time there was a suspension of democracy in response to the 1969 racial riots. So there are these points of ingrained authoritarianism over there, but for me personally, I don't know if it compromises on the entirety of the framework that they have that is quite aligned to democracy. So as we go through the various, or as you go through the various case study and look at effectiveness of control, look at the kind of various forms of government and see what kind of tools they employed in order to control their societies, to maintain some sort of stability, and then judge the effectiveness based on these nuanced reading of the case studies. Okay, as I said, when we look into these 2 terms, I want to sort of do a distinguishing between these 2 terms. There's a reason why Cambridge put these 2 terms in place. It's actually to give you guys a hint that they don't just want a short-term assessment of control. They want a short-term and long-term assessment of control. Look at the idea of control, this concept, in its totality. So in terms of the first part, which is establishing, the time period of assessment for establishing, in my opinion, it can be at the point of assumption of power and authority, plus the immediate to medium term aftermath of that. So it's when governments maneuver themselves into power, and how do they do so? Is it something that is concrete, and is it something that is authentic? And in the immediate and medium term aftermath, were they able to stabilize their control to a good degree? So once again, going down the 2 boxes over here, the red and yellow ones, there are 2 kind of development tracks that we need to take note of in terms of establishing political stability. There are those that veer towards more authoritarian forms of government and using authoritarian methods to assert this political stability. Whereas there are others that also, whereas the second development track is to look at the democratic regimes and how they asserted political stability. One of the things for the democratic regimes that, as mentioned in the previous slide, is that sometimes they also include authoritarian elements. The key question that I think you want to ask yourself is: do these authoritarian elements really compromise on the democratic framework? Do they compromise on the integrity of democracy in these other case studies? Um, or are you comfortable with the fact that democracies can use authoritarian elements in extraordinary circumstances? And if so, then maybe it's still under the framework of democracy, just that there are some departures from the liberal model of democracy that the West subscribes to. In terms of maintaining, we want to look at the time period of assessment as well. It's more longer term period with a special focus on sustainability. So that's one of the big criteria in terms of effectiveness of control. One of the things you want to look at is them coming into power, but also were they able to sustain their form of government? Were they able to sustain providing for political stability in a very authentic and very controlled manner? The the other things that you might want to consider as well is in terms of the longer term assessment of of political control, um, and going into the timeline all the way to 2000, there are things to take note of in the 1980s and the 1990s with democratic resurgence. So authoritarian regimes may have been set up, they may have provided some sort of stability in the 60s, in the 70s, but depending on which country you look at and depending on the type of repression or the amount of repression meted out during authoritarian rule, there might be democratic backlash that would destabilize this authoritarian form of government, that would destabilize the political stability of the country. So that's something that is a limitation. That's something that you can actually look at to critique the form of authoritarian rule and their ability to provide political stability. So that is some limitations you can consider. The next two boxes are continuation of the strength of authoritarian governments or the strength of democratic regimes in the entirety of the time period. That means to say that, well, they may have faced certain challenges, but more or less they were able to overcome them or to meet them in an adequate manner. And therefore, I can say that yeah, these guys actually establish and maintain political stability on the whole very well. Again, looking at our concepts, our key concepts, all these kind of things would come into play. Once again, we must always look at the actors in context. We must always see what kind of trends and developments are going on in the larger political context or the larger societal context. But I think for this topic in particular, and especially relating to this term of effectiveness, we really want to consider change and continuity because, again, this concept would remind us and would encourage us to look at the issue in its entirety across the time frame. And incorporating that into your argument and into your essay would actually help a lot to bring it up to a level of sophistication that can get you the top band of marks. And of course, diversity, like the last slide we talked about, the more you can group your case studies into certain groupings according to trends and patterns and similarities and differences, all this kind of stuff, it will be better for your sophistication. In terms of the tools of control, these are things that we went through last year, and I don't think they should be new to you guys. But in terms of looking at the tools in control, my encouragement to you guys is try not to look at them in isolation. That's number one. Try not to look at the tools in isolation, number one. Number two, always maintain your focus on the focus of the question, which is the effectiveness of control. So we're not really doing a kind of a comparison of tools, but we're using the tools to help us to understand whether or not governments were effective in their control. So the tools, as I mentioned just now, they vary in the nature. Some are more aggressive than others, like let's say the military. Some are more subtle on a more day-to-day basis, so things like the media. And then there are those kind of things that are on an institutional basis as well. So this is about the bureaucracy coming together to solidify their support behind a leader, or the leader actively manipulating various institutions to consolidate his rule, using performance legitimacy in order to show up his support and his government support. Uh, Electoral manipulation, this one I think you guys know about. Patronage networks is about that kind of personal relationships that the leader has with key allies or friends or relatives, and how he injects them into the various key sectors of society in order to make sure that his rule is very entrenched. The last one that is relatively new for all of us is looking at this idea of democracy and how it can be used as a tool. I think for many authoritarian regimes, even though they may be a military government or a government that is very authoritarian in nature, actually there might still be some semblance of democracy practiced in those societies. Whether or not these forms of democracy or these processes are authentic or not, I think that's highly in question. But nonetheless, democracy in its even in these kind of forms can transfer political capital to the leaders. It can provide some sort of legitimacy to them, and this could be something that is very sustainable. It is very immediate in its effects. Every time there's some sort of protest against authoritarian form of government in Southeast Asia, or actually anywhere in the world, one of the first things they would do is to try to use constitutional processes or democratic processes to placate the population, but not really doing anything substantial, not really making any meaningful change. Just to give you an illustration of this, we look at the case study of Burma. And in 1988, there was the revolutions, the democratic revolutions of 1988. And what happened was that in the aftermath of these revolutions, keep in mind that these revolutions were huge and they were substantial people power kind of movements. And of course, our shining beacon of democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi, was one of the key figures of that revolution. In the aftermath of that, Ne Win resigned, and there were some changes in the government, and there was some semblance of more constitutional processes, a departure from military rule. But at the end of the day, Ne Win still orchestrated events behind the scene, even though he had formally and officially resigned, but he was still at the back of it, moving all the chess pieces. The subsequent leaders that came to Burma, that came to lead Burma, were all his cronies or his puppets. And this is the kind of device or mechanism that sometimes authoritarian leaders would choose to use in order to prevent another backlash like this from happening, and thereby allowing them to continue their form of government and allowing them to keep power. And you can see till today the military holds a huge position in politics, and their influence has never really waned. So a military government or an authoritarian form of government, not all the time they need to use the military to enforce some sort of control. Of course, the military, with its own unique qualities, it is very, very quick, very decisive, very effective in terms of suppression. So yeah, those kind are useful for extraordinary events. But if you do this on a daily basis, it's going to have severe repercussions. Sometimes you need subtle forms of control, something more structural, something more subtle, something more indirect, something that is more amicable to the population, something that gives the population a semblance of autonomy, of freedom or rights. It's a fine balance, and authoritarian governments, some of them actually can strike a balance between these two kind of things. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that authoritarian governments don't only have one tool of control, they actually have a variety of things they can use. Sometimes the tools that they use are not authoritarian in nature, but it can still fall under their kind of basket of tools. And speaking of that, I will encourage you guys to look at these tools not in isolation, but in terms of a basket of tools that governments tend to use. So in a sense, you do two layers. The first layer is you group the countries into certain trends of their form of governance, so authoritarian ones or military ones or democratic ones, whatever it is. And then within these basket of groups of countries, you can ascribe or look at a basket of tools that would serve as commonalities among these groups of countries or within these groups of countries, and using these tools show whether or not these governments were effective in their control over a long period of time. And speaking of effectiveness of control, I think across the years I find that a lot of students are very apprehensive of this term effectiveness, and especially when it comes to criteria setting. So let's be kind of brave about it and really deal with this in great detail. For criteria setting for effectiveness, and in this topic, what I'll look to is two things: the degree and depth of control, and as well as the sustainability of control. Now, the degree and depth of control, the ability to prevent or deter opposition, and the ability to deal with opposition when it arises to ensure continuity of political control and overall national stability. I think this idea of control doesn't mean that nothing bad ever happens or no challenge ever rises against the regime, whatever it is, democratic or authoritarian. I think the idea of control is two things: is in minimizing this degree of backlash or minimizing these disturbances. But it's when and also it's when these kind of disturbances arise, are they able to deal with the situation and bring back societal or political order to the country? And if they are able to do so, then I don't think I really want to fault them for not preventing the situation from arising in the first place. But I want to credit them for um, I want to credit them for their ability to deal with it, and I also want to look at the aftermath. Was their form of governance um, able to continue? Was there societal stability, political stability in the aftermath of those disturbances? And if so, then actually I can credit them for dealing well with these kind of issues, and that could go into my criteria of effectiveness. The second thing to look at sustainability, this one is what I mentioned just now. We want to look at the longer term assessment, and we also want to look at the quality of their control, so without any significant compromise to governmental integrity or national stability. Governmental integrity in this case just simply means whether or not the government is a stable one, whether or not the government has effective control, whether or not the government is competent, whether or not the government can um, stay in power to chart national development and to implement its various policies and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, these are the two big kind of criteria that I look to when I judge effectiveness. You may have more. I don't think this list is exhaustive, so please do encourage you to find more if you want to. And the last thing over here is just basically about the kind of essay questions again that you can look at. Maximum governments were able to assert political stability in their countries. A note about maximum governments. According to Cambridge, they do classify the authoritarian democracies as max governments as well. So Singapore and Malaysia, Philippines under Marcos, they will all fall under this term max government. So if this term max governments comes out, it's not that you have to discount yourself from these case studies. You can actually still include them. Just maybe include a nuance to explain that these are a different form of max government. And in fact, within our authoritarian group of countries, their versions and their variety of max governments are also something that you can point out, the nuance that you can showcase. Um, and of course, at the end of this question, the time frame, 1945 to 2000, Cambridge will always encourage you to look at the totality of the time frame. They will literally put it in the question for you to remind you that you can use this entire thing. Again, Cambridge doesn't really practice negative marking, but if you do not include the entirety of the time frame, you are limiting the argument and you are discounting yourself from the top bands of the LOMS grading system. Second one, the military was the most effective mechanism in asserting political stability. This one is slightly more specific. We are looking at a comparison of tools. So questions like this can come out. But once again, I think the focus will still be most effective And it goes back to effectiveness, and you still have to set criteria. Just that in this case, we are looking at the different mechanisms and we're looking at the different tools of control, while still looking at the various groupings of case studies as well. So that's all for today's podcast. I hope that this will be useful and meaningful for you in your revision. I will continue to do this. Okay, this is a hidden message to check if you guys have watched the entire podcast all the way to the end. I am going to write something down on a piece of paper, and I'm gonna hide it under one of the green tables outside LT2 on the underside of it, and whoever finds it writes his or her name on the back of this piece of paper, and puts it back in my pigeonhole first will get the secret prize. And now back to the music.